The snow was still falling when they left her. Not just left, abandoned, as if she were a stain they couldn't scrub out. Mira stood barefoot, blood pooling beneath her in the frozen dirt, her newborn daughter pressed to her chest. The baby's cries split the winter silence, raw and sharp like a blade through fog. But her family stood distant, shoulders stiff, eyes like stone. Not a single hand reaching forward, not a single heart softened. They said she brought shame. They said the sin wasn't just the birth, but that it was a girl, as if her daughter was the curse. One by one, they turned their backs, her mother, her brother, the preacher's wife. Not a word, not a tear, just backs. Like wolves sensing weakness and leaving the wounded behind. And just like that, Mira was alone, except for the newborn she held like the last fragile ember of her own soul. She didn't beg, she didn't scream. There was no one left to listen. So she did what broken women have always done. She held on, tighter, fiercer, even as the cold clawed at her skin, even as the silence roared louder than the wind, she refused to let go. Her hands, trembling and cracked, wrapped around her daughter like a vow. She would not die begging. And then, just when the dark felt endless, he appeared. From between the pines, a figure on horseback emerged like a memory she didn't know she had. A man wrapped in shadows and furs, tall, silent, watching. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with something else. Recognition, like he saw her for what she was, not a sinner, not a mistake, but someone worth saving. He didn't speak, he didn't ask permission. He dismounted, wrapped her in a thick buffalo hide cloak, and lifted her and the child as though they were the last light left in a dying world. And maybe they were. The man was Cheyenne, a warrior. The kind the town whispered about in fear and ignorance, blaming them whenever cattle vanished or the woods whispered too loud. The kind they painted as heathens. But it was no preacher who found Mira that night, no neighbor with a warm hearth, no family member suddenly moved by guilt. It was a stranger, a so-called savage, who crossed the snow for her. Now let me ask you something. What kind of world lets a woman bleed alone in the snow, only to be rescued by the very person she was taught to fear? What kind of faith turns its back on life just because it arrives in a form that doesn't fit its rules? And what kind of strength does it take for a woman to still believe in anything after that? That night, Mira didn't find salvation. She became it, for herself and the child she had no one to protect but her own broken body. And the man? He didn't ride in as a hero. He simply stepped forward, offered warmth, offered silence that didn't wound. And sometimes that's more powerful than any miracle. They rode into the dark together, the baby swaddled between them, snow falling like ash from a world that had already burned Mira once. Behind them, judgment, shame, the hiss of old names thrown like stones. Ahead of them, unknown, cold, dangerous, but also maybe something else. Maybe survival, maybe freedom, maybe the start of something stronger than what was lost. Because sometimes the miracle isn't being saved, it's knowing you're still worth saving at all. And Mira, she didn't walk out of that forest as the woman they abandoned. She rode out as someone no one would ever bury again. And that's where the story really begins.
They called her cursed. Not to her face, of course. People in Dead Hollow didn't need to raise their voices to cut someone down. All they had to do was look away, whisper behind a fence, close the door just a little too fast. Mira lived at the edge of town, literally, past the last crooked fence and the chapel's rusted bell, just before the woods began curling into themselves like a secret no one dared speak aloud. Her house stood alone, a small cottage, sagging under years of silence and suspicion. It had once belonged to her mother, a healer, a midwife, a woman too kind or too strange for a place like Dead Hollow. Maybe both. When her mother died, the town didn't grieve. They exhaled relief. And they turned that same cold breath toward Mira. She was a quiet girl, limped when she walked, kept her eyes down, not from shame, but exhaustion. After the barn fire, years ago, no one said it outright, but everyone seemed to agree. It was her fault. They never explained how. They didn't need to. The town didn't deal in proof, only in stories whispered just loud enough to stain. She was useful, yes, always working, carrying water buckets with her bad ankle, folding linens at the inn, mending shirts with fingers chapped raw from cold. But no one said thank you. They accepted her labor like they accepted the wind, present but unwanted. At church, she sat alone in the back pew, not because of any rule, it was just understood. The pastor never blessed her by name. The mothers pulled their children close when she walked by, and once, when she offered bread to a neighbor's child, the mother slapped it to the ground and hissed, "She doesn't need anything from your kind." What kind was that, exactly? The kind that didn't cry when called names? The kind that walked home alone? The kind that never once courted a man, never smiled too brightly, never dared to ask for more? She had once let a boy hold her hand at the county fair. He was beaten by morning. They called her barren. They called her wrong. But they were wrong about that. She wasn't barren, just careful. She wore loose aprons, avoided light, and moved like a ghost through a town that never wanted to see her. No one noticed the change in her shape. No one asked, because no one ever looked close enough to care. And maybe that was the cruelest part. Not the slurs, not the silence, but the indifference. That they could look right through her and somehow still hate what they saw. Dead Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a wound that never healed. A town stitched together by judgment and fear, where the wrong kind of woman became a mirror no one wanted to face. But Mira stayed. She lit a candle in her windowsill every night. Not out of hope. Hope had been chased away years ago. She did it because her mother used to. A habit, not a prayer. A flicker of light in a world determined to erase her. What do we become when the world decides we don't exist? Some break, some disappear, and some, like Mira, just keep walking. Not to prove anyone wrong, not even to survive, but because there's something inside certain women, quiet, bruised, misunderstood, that refuses to die, no matter how many times the world tries to bury them. Mira was not a saint, not a witch, not a warning. She was just a girl carrying more weight than anyone ever saw. A girl who, even after everything, still chose to bring life into a world that had never shown her mercy. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most radical act of all.
She gave birth alone. No hands to hold. No warm water. No midwife whispering, "You're almost there." Just splinters in the floorboards, blood soaked into old rags, and the kind of pain that cracks through bone and soul at the same time. Her daughter came into the world screaming, small and warm, eyes sealed shut against the cold. And in that moment, despite everything, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Love. Pure, terrifying, unapologetic. Not the kind of love that asks permission. The kind that roots itself deep and fast, like fire finding dry wood. She named her Elira, after her mother,
a name carried like a whisper through generations, one that once meant healing and defiance. She wrapped the baby in the last clean cloth she owned and held her close, cheek against cheek. For the first time in so long, silence didn't weigh on Mara like a curse. It felt like a pause in a song, a breath before everything could begin again. But the town didn't see a beginning. They saw defiance. They didn't knock to offer help. No bread, no warm milk, not even a blanket. They came with stones, with spit, with fire in their eyes and scripture in their mouths. "Whose is it?" they shouted. "Whose sin do you carry?" They didn't ask how she survived it, how she managed to bring life into a world that had only ever tried to crush hers. They didn't ask if she was okay, because they didn't want to know. In Dead Hollow, people never needed answers, just someone to blame. They called a town meeting. The pastor raised his voice while the women whispered behind their fences. The men stayed silent, which was always the worst sound, because silence in places like that is complicity dressed in politeness. And one morning, she found it, a letter nailed to her door, just 10 words. "Leave by sundown or be taken." That was it. No plea, no warning, just a verdict. So Mara packed what little she had, a bottle, a threadbare shawl, her newborn wrapped tight against her chest, her body still torn from labor, her limp worse than ever. No horse, no cart, just 2 bruised feet and a soul that refused to break. No one offered to help. Not one neighbor stepped into the street. They just watched, from behind curtains and shutters, through shame that was never strong enough to stop cruelty. Can you imagine that? Walking out of the home you've ever known, holding your child, knowing you've just been exiled for giving life? But here's what they never understood. Women like Mara don't break. We bend, we bleed, but we keep walking. Because there is no other choice. What she carried that day was more than a child. It was a promise that the hate she endured would not be her daughter's inheritance, that love, even when born in shadows, could still blaze like wildfire. She walked into the woods not as a ghost, not as a warning, but as a woman who had already survived the worst day of her life and still had the courage to keep going. They thought they were casting her out, but in truth, they were freeing her. Because no town that punishes a mother for choosing love deserves her presence. And no child deserves to be raised in a place where kindness is conditional. And so she disappeared into the pines. Not to vanish, but to begin again. And as the snow swallowed her footsteps, the town behind her exhaled relief. But what they didn't know, what they never even imagined, was that miracles don't die in exile. They grow in it.
The forest didn't welcome her. It simply didn't turn her away, and maybe that was enough. The snow was falling harder when he found her. Mira was curled beneath the broken arms of an old oak, her baby pressed close to her chest, both of them barely holding on. Her lips were cracked, her hands numb, her heart emptier than the sky above. And then came the sound. Hooves, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow like thunder muffled in velvet. She tensed. She had no strength left to run, no weapon, no voice. All she could do was shield her daughter with her own body and brace for whatever cruelty might follow. But the figure that emerged from the trees was not what she'd expected. Tall, silent, cloaked in black hide and shadows, a Cheyenne Warrior, with feathers braided into his hair and red paint slashed across one cheekbone. The kind of man the townspeople warned about with narrowed eyes and lowered voices. The kind they blamed when crops failed or cattle wandered too far. But he didn't raise a weapon. He knelt, and in a voice he didn't understand, he spoke, not like a command, not like a threat, but like a question. Gentle, steady, as if he could see the storm she carried and wanted to stand inside it with her. She nodded.
That was all she could offer, a single aching gesture of trust from a woman who had been shown nothing but betrayal. He removed his cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders without touching her skin. Then he lifted her, slowly, carefully, as though she were something sacred, a mother, a flame, a life worth preserving. His name was Tasani. She wouldn't learn that for days, but even without words, there was something in the way he moved, how he didn't flinch at her limp, didn't stare at the baby with suspicion, didn't speak to her like she was broken. At the camp deep in the woods, 3 lodges stood between pine and wind. Smoke curled into the sky. A woman with gray hair opened the door and beckoned her in, without questions or judgment. Inside, it was warm, painfully, shockingly warm. Mira sank to the floor by the fire and wrapped her daughter tighter in the Cheyenne cloak. For the first time in years, she cried, and not from fear, but from something harder to name: relief. Over the days that followed, they didn't speak much. He barely spoke English, she knew no Cheyenne. But kindness doesn't always need translation. A nod, a shared piece of bread, a silent fire between them at night. Tasani showed her how to carry fire safely through the woods, how to spot rabbit tracks, how to bind a wound with moss. She showed him how to patch shirts with tiny, stubborn stitches, and how to make the baby laugh by whistling through a blade of grass. She hadn't smiled in years, but that first laugh, soft, startled, escaped her before she could stop it, and she didn't take it back. They didn't talk about love, or salvation, or the ache of things lost. But in the way he handed her a bowl of stew, or the way he stood between her and the wind without needing to be asked, something began to grow. Not fast, not loud, but strong, like roots under snow. You see, sometimes healing doesn't come from those who claim to know what's best for you. Sometimes it comes from someone who doesn't try to fix you at all, just sits beside you in the darkness and lights a fire, waiting for your hands to feel warm enough to reach toward it. Mira had been silenced for so long, she forgot what it felt like to be seen without being judged. But Tasani didn't see a curse. He saw a woman who had walked through fire, carrying life in her arms, and that, to him, was sacred.
Peace never comes without a price. It had been weeks since Mira had seen the edge of the world she once called home. Weeks of learning how to carry firewood without drawing stairs, how to laugh without flinching, how to sleep without dreams turning into knives. In the warmth of the forest lodge, with her baby pressed against her chest and Tasani just a few paces away, it was easy to pretend that the world had forgotten her. But hate remembers, and fear never forgets a woman who refuses to die quietly. It started with whispers, stories traded at the saloon, muttered at church pews. Someone had seen a woman in the woods, cradling a child beneath a warrior's cloak. Someone else swore they saw strange fires glowing between the pines. In Dead Hollow, that was all it took. Rumors didn't need proof, just direction. And one gray morning, Mira felt it. Not in the wind, not in the trees, in her bones. Tasani felt it too. The birds had gone silent, the horses uneasy. Danger has a way of arriving before it announces itself. They came at midday, 5 men on horseback, dust in their beards and rifles slung across their backs. The sheriff led them, his jaw still crooked from a truth Mira had once forced him to swallow. Behind them, faces she knew, men who had once looked away when she needed help. Now they looked at her like prey. "There she is," the sheriff spat, "the witch who bedded a savage and birthed sin." Tasani stepped forward, calm, solid, a wall of breath and bone. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't reach for his knife. He just stood, unmoving, between them and Mira. For a moment, the men hesitated. Because what do you do with a man who doesn't flinch when your hands hold death? They fired anyway. The first shot shattered the silence, striking Tasani's horse. Chaos erupted. Children screamed from the lodges. The elder woman cried out, and Mira, clutching LRA to her chest, ran. She didn't look back, her body still fragile from birth, her legs no match for snowbanks or rage. She ran until her foot caught a buried root, and the world spun sideways. She fell hard near the creek, baby still in her arms. Before she could rise, they were on her. Rough hands yanked her up. She fought like an animal, teeth and nails and fury, but they ripped LRA from her arms with no mercy. No! It wasn't a word, it was a wound, torn from the depths of something primal. They laughed. They mocked her. One boy, a face she recognized from church choir, grabbed her hair and slammed her to her knees. He pulled a knife and pressed it to her cheek. "Should have finished you the first time," he sneered. And then, the second shot rang out. Not from their rifles, from the trees. The boy's hat flew clean off his head. He stumbled back, pale with shock. Another shot, clean, sharp, splintered the sheriff's canteen. Water spilled like blood. And then Tasani stepped into view. No anger in his face, no vengeance in his voice, just focus, purpose. He aimed low, measured. Every shot was a warning, not a kill. A man who had faced storms and chose peace, even when no one else did. The sheriff cursed, stepping back. "Not worth the blood," he muttered. One by one the others followed, dragging their shame behind them like broken rifles. Mira was still kneeling, shaking, bleeding, gasping for breath. The baby cried nearby, helpless in the snow. Tasani didn't rush. He crouched, lifted LRA like something sacred, and then he knelt before Mira, offering her child back with both hands. No words, no rescue cloaked in glory, just presence, quiet, unshakable. And then with a stillness that said everything words could not, Tasani untied a small braid of leather from his wrist. He placed it in Mira's palm. A Cheyenne oath, not of ownership, of loyalty, of standing beside someone even when the world turns against them again and again and again. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her fingers closed over the braid. And in that moment, after everything they'd tried to take, she chose not to break. She chose to believe in something else, something better, something worth surviving for.
No one gave them permission to start over, but they didn't ask. By the time spring reached the valley, Mira, Tasani, and little LRA had begun carving out a life the world never intended for them, a place not borrowed, not tolerated, theirs. It was a small patch of earth nestled between the trees, where the river bent soft and slow, feeding land wild enough to stay untouched by town hands. There was no fence line, no church bells, no eyes watching from behind curtains, just space, just sky, just breath. They built it with their hands, splinters and sweat and stubborn faith. A small cabin, a corral, 3 horses, 1 dream. Mira learned to ride, not side saddle like the town demanded of its women, but upright and wild, knees pressed firm into the horse's ribs, hair streaming behind her like a flag no one could claim. Tasani taught her to read the sky for storms and the dirt for deer tracks. She taught him how to stitch shirts with fine, careful fingers and how to make LRA laugh by tugging dandelions under her chin. They traded silence for laughter. Trade became rhythm, and rhythm became routine.
There were still whispers when Mira walked into town for supplies, still narrowed eyes when Tasani traded hides and herbs. They called them things behind their backs: fallen woman, heathen, witch wife. But those words no longer pierced like they used to, because when you've bled in snow and survived it, there isn't much left in gossip that can break you. And LRA, she grew in that freedom like wild lavender. Mira taught her not just how to survive, but how to love without apology, how to press seeds into the soil with both hands, how to bake bread over open coals, how to braid strength into silence. Tasani showed her how to follow a trail, how to whistle to birds, how to tell stories without saying a word. Their love wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady. And steady is rare in a world that demands speed. At night they sat beneath stars so thick they looked stitched into the sky. No vows were spoken, no papers signed, but in the way he reached for her hand across the fire, in the way she leaned her head against his shoulder in the stillness, that was the promise. They didn't live by the town's definition of good. They lived by something older, something wilder, a kind of truth that doesn't need to be preached to be believed. Mira no longer lit a candle in the window out of habit. She lit it for LRA now, so her daughter would grow up knowing that hope wasn't something whispered. It was something you made. With your body, with your voice, with your bare hands in the dirt. Some nights when the fire burned low and the wind shifted through the valley like an old memory, Mira would press her palm against the cabin wall and remember the girl she used to be, the one who walked alone, who bled alone, who feared her own shadow. And then she'd turn and see her daughter asleep in the corner, a blanket clutched to her chest, safe. She'd see Tasani mending tack or carving bone by lamplight, his brow soft, his silence warm. And she would breathe, because this life didn't come from mercy. It didn't come from forgiveness. It was built by two hands that never stopped shaking, by a heart that had every reason to close, but chose, again and again, to stay open. They weren't waiting for the world to change. They just stopped letting it define them. Because some fires don't ask for permission. They burn anyway.
Peace is never permanent when the world thinks you don't deserve it. The sun was low when the sheriff rode in again, this time alone, dressed cleaner than usual, a glint of metal on his chest and a folded piece of paper in his hand. He arrived like a storm, pretending to be rain, calm, polite, but dangerous in a way only men with power and no conscience can be. He stepped down from his pale horse and smiled like he'd already won. "Murder," he said, "reckless discharge of a firearm, harboring a fugitive, and aiding an enemy of the state." The words didn't land like new accusations. They felt rehearsed, polished, practiced on the ride over. And then he turned his eyes toward Tasani. "He's not a citizen, Missy," the sheriff continued, slick and slow. "That makes it real simple for the courts." Tasani didn't flinch. He never did. But Mira did. Because she'd heard this tone before. The kind of voice that tries to make injustice sound like law, like reason, like mercy. The sheriff pulled out the warrant, waved it in the air like it mattered, and then he looked at LRA, cradled in Mira's arms. "She deserves better," he said. "You both do. Come back. Leave him. We'll forget all this ever happened." Forgiveness, offered like a bone to a starving dog. But it wasn't forgiveness. It was a leash, and Mira had worn enough chains in her life to know the difference. So when the sheriff reached forward, just a little too fast, just a little too confidently to grab the child from her arms, Mira didn't hesitate. The butt of her father's old hunting rifle cracked against his jaw like thunder in dry air. The sheriff fell, blood blooming in his mouth like a flower gone wrong. Tasani stepped forward, silent, calm, tearing the warrant in half with one smooth motion. The pieces drifted to the ground, light as ash. Final. "We leave," he said, and that was all. No speeches, no explanations. Because when you know the cost of staying too long in a place that only tolerates your pain, you don't wait to be chased. You walk away first. They moved quickly, packing only what mattered. Saddlebags, blankets, a small pouch of herbs. LRA asleep, trusting, her head on Mira's chest like it had always belonged there. They rode out under moonlight, Tasani's hand steady on the reins, Mira's jaw set. Behind them, a cabin full of memories. Ahead, the unknown. Again. And then came the river. The water ran fast and cold, black as iron and just as unforgiving. A place where doubt lingers, where the voices in your head whisper, "What if you drown? What if you fail her? What if you never make it across?" Mira stared at the current, heart pounding, breath tight. Tasani didn't reach to carry her. He simply held out his hand. Not to save her, to stand with her. She nodded, hitched LRA higher, and nudged the horse into the freezing water. The current grabbed at her legs, tore at her skirt, dragged like all the weight she'd ever tried to leave behind. But step by step, she pressed forward. "We're stronger than this," she whispered. And they were. When they reached the far bank, Tasani laughed, low, breathless, almost surprised. Mira laughed too, wet, shaking, but free. They didn't look back, because there was nothing left worth returning to. Weeks later, in the northern hills, they found it. An abandoned cabin tucked where the grass ran silver with braided rivers. No maps marked it, no stories claimed it. It was their blank page. And this time, the life they would build wouldn't come with a warning, or a price, or a leash. It would be hard and lonely and scarred. But it would be theirs. Because sometimes, survival is not about staying alive. It's about choosing who you become next. And Mira, she didn't choose forgiveness. She chose freedom.
They didn't find paradise. They found a cabin, weather-beaten, half-swallowed by vines, tucked deep in the northern hills where the rivers braided silver through the grass. The roof leaked, the well was dry, but it was theirs. No names etched in the wood, no rules nailed to the door, just a place waiting to be claimed by people who had nothing left but each other. And so they began again. Mira planted seeds with her bare hands, not just for food, but for hope. She taught LRA how to press the soil down, gentle but firm, the way her mother once taught her. Tasani repaired the roof, built a corral, shaped the land without conquering it. At night, they sat by the fire without speaking, watching embers rise like prayers no one needed to hear out loud. Then, one spring, their second daughter came into the world, born in a room warmed by love, not shame, born into hands that knew how to hold without hurting. They named her Mara after Mira's mother, the woman who had once whispered to a little girl that she was more than what the world said. And for the first time, Mira believed it. She braided Mara's hair with care, not just to make it neat, but to pass something on, a rhythm, a knowing, a message written in every twist of every strand. You are not what they call you. You are what you choose to become. Years passed. No church ever blessed their home. No town crier ever announced their joy. But joy came anyway, in the form of muddy footprints across the cabin floor, wildflowers picked by tiny hands, the creak of the rocking chair where Tasani carved toys from pine.
And one morning, Mira knew what she had to do. She saddled her mare, tied LRA's shoes tight, and rode, just once, back to Dead Hollow. Tasani rode beside her, silent and steady, the way he always did. The town hadn't changed much. Dust still clung to the windows. The preacher still sat like a statue behind the chapel steps. And the sheriff? His jaw still crooked from the last time Mira taught him what fear felt like. Every head turned when she arrived. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was stunned, like ghosts had wandered back from the woods. Mira dismounted, lifted LRA to the ground with hands that no longer shook. She walked right up to the council steps, pulled the letter of pardon from her dress, and dropped it into the dirt. "I don't want your forgiveness. I'm not coming back." There was no applause, no thunder in the sky, just a ripple, like a quiet truth had finally touched a wound that refused to heal. And then she turned her back on them all, mounted up, and rode away. Not in shame, not in fear, in triumph. Dust curled behind her like smoke from a bridge already burned. She didn't stop riding until the town was nothing but a memory swallowed by trees. That night, by the river, under a sky stitched with stars, Tasani pulled a small leather strip from his satchel. Woven through it was a single white bead, the color of snow melt and second chances. He knelt, not as a man begging, but as a man honoring, and tied it around her wrist, right over the scars that once told the story of ropes, of pain, of being dragged by judgment. Now those scars held something else, an oath, a rebirth, a claim to her own story. Mira didn't become someone new. She simply became fully herself for the first time. Not a curse, not a ghost, but a woman who took what the world tried to break and built something unshakable from its ashes. Because some miracles aren't loud. Some don't come dressed in light or thunder. Some look like a girl planting lavender where no one thought it could grow. Some look like a mother laughing by firelight. Some look like survival, rewritten into legacy. Mira was never a curse. She was someone's miracle all along.